So, I think we'll get started. Herzlich willkommen, grüezi miteinander, herzlich willkommen zu dem Open.
Welcome to this open forum.
To today's open forum. What a nice surprise to see so many young people here today. We're very glad to have you here. We will be talking about the topic of peace. I think a topic that we cannot speak enough about, so I'm very glad that it is one topic that is going to be addressed on this forum today. Before we get started, as you know, we have the Swiss president here as one of our panelists, and he would have liked to introduce himself, but also address some words to you, to the population of Davos, to you all here in the room. So before we get started with the panel, where I will be introducing all the panelists to you afterwards, I will leave the stage and the microphone to the president of the Swiss Confederation, to Ignacio Cassis. Welcome.
Dankeschön, Herr Gredig.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gredig, for this warm welcome. Dear public from Davos, dear ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, also from outside of Davos. It's a great pleasure for me today to meet you today in this context in order to talk about this very difficult subject in the framework of the World Economic Forum. But it is first and foremost a pleasure to meet again, because it has been 2 years that we met last time in January 2020 when we organized the last World Economic Forum. And these 2 years feel like 20 years. Now we don't have snow. We are not in January. We are 2 years on. Everything has changed. There is war somewhere near us. And this meeting together with you today, we would like to use to discuss with you in order to structure our thoughts, if possible. Yesterday morning, I arrived in Davos, and I asked myself the question, what has happened since my last visit? Because everything that happened during the last 2 years goes beyond our imagination. Just remember, in January 2020, amongst others, there was a virus that appeared in Wuhan, and we discussed it. We talked about another disease that we had already in the past, and nobody thought that this virus could end up in a worldwide pandemic, costing millions of lives and turning our lives upside down for 2 years. These were my thoughts. And after that, one crisis followed the next. And in Switzerland, it was really unbelievable. On the 23rd of February, we had our National Assembly, and we went into a press conference to inform the press. And I had this task, wonderful task, to tell everybody that the pandemic was over on the 24th of February. And only a couple of hours later, on the 24th of February, on 4 o'clock in the morning, the invasion by the Russian troops started. So only a couple of moments, we went from one crisis to the next. Dear ladies and gentlemen, and dear young people, there are so many of you here, and I'm very delighted about that. So there was a day of joy, and the very next day we entered into a new crisis. And we asked ourselves an awful lot of questions. We thought that we in Europe, we had found ways and means to solve all our conflicts without warring against each other. Like in a family, of course, we have got differences of opinions. We do discuss, and we are not of one opinion all the time, but we have learned to be constructive in our conflicts. We know it is important to find a solution. All of a sudden, we have to face a new reality because these mechanisms don't work any longer on a state level. Peace in Europe or elsewhere is God-given and goes without working on it. I was born in 1961, and I'm part of that generation who would never have thought to ever see war again in my generation, because that was my parents', my grandparents' history. War, even the term as such, was archived, was put aside. But no, ladies and gentlemen, war is back again. And of course, we have seen it was everywhere in Africa, in the Near East, in Asia, but not here, back at home. And that was a mistake in our thinking that we all committed. And the younger generation, the children of my generation, they never thought about war because their parents thought the concept of war in Europe was archived. And that's why we were so surprised and so shocked when seeing what was happening. As a result, we have to see that we have to fight. Democracy must be stronger than tyranny. Law must be stronger than anything else. Switzerland, as a relatively small country, is convinced that we are protected by law, the international law, law between countries, that a rule-based order is protecting us because we don't have that military power that would be necessary in order to defend ourselves against bigger states. So self-determination must be stronger than suppression and oppression. And 2 + 2 + 1 means freedom. Dear young people, freedom is not God-given. Freedom has to be earned every day, has to be fought for every day. And in view of this violation of international law and humanitarian international law, well, Switzerland has condemned this aggression. We have accepted the EU sanctions, and against that backdrop, we discussed our neutrality. We had discussed whether this neutrality is compatible with the current situation. And we were also very active with regard to humanitarian aid. As you remember, we had actions, Glückskette, and sponsor days, more than 100 million Swiss francs. And we also invested tax money. So we are at about 4 million Swiss francs altogether, which have been invested. Yesterday, in the plenary session of the World Economic Forum, I talked about cooperative neutrality. What do I mean with that? Well, our neutrality is not rigid. We had to adapt ourselves to reality. Neutrality is not an objective. Neutrality is a means in order to secure security, and the objective is freedom. Neutrality is only a means to an end. We stand together with other countries. We use neutrality. We defend our values, and we stand together when we talk about reestablishing peace and freedom. And we use rules, as I mentioned earlier on, rules that will allow a peaceful living together. Switzerland is active on every level in order to ensure the reestablishment of peace. That is our main objective. Let the weapons be laid down. Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear people from Davos, at the beginning of July, at the beginning of July, with Ukraine, we will organize a Ukraine recovery conference in Lugano. And in Davos, we talked with the Minister for Foreign Affairs and also with the President in order to organize that conference and in order to structure that conference in an orderly way. That is one step towards a peaceful Europe, and we, as Switzerland, we are part of this. Thank you very much for joining us today, and I'm looking forward to discussing with you. Thank you so much.
So, ganz herzlich willkommen noch einmal von.
Welcome again to all of you. Thank you, Mr. President, for these introductory remarks. I'm pleased to welcome all of you here today. We will discuss a topic that is among the most important on our agenda this week. We will have a bilingual panel in English and in German.
We have translation here also for you if you should wish to follow us either in German or in English. This should be a very interactive session, meaning that we will open the stage and the discussion at least 30 minutes before the end. So if you have any questions, comments, please go ahead and ask them. It can be about Swiss neutrality, but it doesn't have to. If you have any questions to one of the panelists, please do so. We will open early enough. And if you want to share what you hear here, and if you want to contribute to the discussion online and on social media, you can of course do so as well. Hashtag WEF22 or hashtag OpenForum22. We've seen it in the short film in the introduction. We are at a turning point of history. What we've gone through and what we've seen and what we've experienced this year is indeed something extraordinary. We always hear the word in German, Zeitenwende. It is a turning point of history. And I think if you hear some of the stories today, you would share this thought too. Meaning, what can we do with it and what does the future hold for us? And if we speak about this issue and this problem, I think we will have to speak about peace, of course, and how to work together for peace. Because President Kassis told us yesterday in his opening speech as well that this is a task that we can only do together. And I think that's why we're all here, and that's why we're going to hear about different stories today, very impressive stories, and we'll try to share all this and try to at least try to find maybe some common ground and some solution. Let me introduce the panelists to you. You've already heard the president of the Swiss Confederation. If I start way on the left, welcome Nadia Murad. She's a Nobel Peace Laureate, president of Nadia's Initiative, co-founder of Global Survivors Fund. She's from the Yazidi minority in northern Iraq, and she's got an exceptional story that I would like her to share with us maybe in a minute or two. Then, if I go on my immediate left, very welcome to a Ukrainian guest here on the panel, Yevgenia Botnia. She's the curator of the Kiev Hub from the Young Global Leaders at the World Economic Forum, and she's gone through the beginning of the war, and she is helping wherever she can, and we'll be happy and curious to hear what you are doing and what you can do, and also, of course, what we can do. And finally, another guest from the Ukraine. We have Yuriy Vitrenko here. He's the Chief Executive Officer of Naftogaz of Ukraine, stately owned oil and gas company with, and I was really surprised to read that, 52,000 employees, a huge company which has many challenges at the moment. We're very curious to hear from him how these challenges look like and what he can do to provide much needed energy to the people in the Ukraine. Maybe to start this discussion, Yevgenia, I said it, you were based, I must say, in Kiev, and we heard the Swiss president on the 24th of February. On the day, 3 months ago, war started. How did you live that experience until now? What did it make with you?
So thank you for your question. Let me share my personal story, because I think that we need to point that the war started for Ukraine not 3 months ago with the February 24th, but the war started in 2014 with the Russian invasion to Donetsk and occupation of Crimea. Being myself personally displaced from Donetsk because I was born in Donetsk, I moved to Kiev in 2014 to proceed with the studies and supporting Ukraine. So this is also my point, that I already facing for the second time the Russian invasion, and it's actively affected my life. From 2014, we were really actively involved, and it's personally as well touched me, because after this, you really feel that you need to work for your country. You really need to stand for your country, and you need to take active actions to protect your country. In 24th of February, actually, the whole nation woke up with the sound of bombing, and it was a turning point, a historical turning point as well. The life has changed dramatically for all of us, but I think with the first minute, as an active young community leader as well in Ukraine, we decided with my friends that we actually need to take an action. We cannot just stand and flee the country. We need to do something so that the country can survive and resist. And I think that Ukraine demonstrated a huge potential on how we can unite the whole world around it and show that how foreigners can support Ukraine. Here we are. So we are a community of global shapers, which is a young talented people from diverse background. We gathered within the 2 hours of the Russian invasion, like at 7 a.m. in the morning, saying that, okay, what can we do as a youth? Having a great international networking with global shapers, with 1,100,000 people around the world and 450 hubs around the globe. So we decided that actually our niche is to show how foreigners can support Ukraine. We started as a crowd-funded resource of information, showing small steps how foreigners can support Ukraine by providing a donation to the funding, funded to the army or military support or any other essential goods. How you can join with the protest in your city, how you can help by sharing in social media the information about Ukraine and Russian invasion. So the whole concept is that Ukraine is a sunflower, as a potential for the whole Europe, right? And the sunflower had some seeds. So basically, every seed matters. Any support that you can provide to Ukraine, whether it will be a $5 fund or it will be a hosting a Ukrainian person in Europe, this is such a great help that you can do to support Ukraine. Yeah.
There's a beautiful example already when we talk already about what we can do. If we stay for a minute in the Ukraine, these events have something that, you know, it's so unpredictable, or in that case maybe a little bit more predictable, but you have to change very quickly. Yuriy, if I can bring you in as someone who is in charge of a huge company, as I said, and an important company for the well-being of a whole country, of a whole population. How did you react end of February when all this started and when the war came to your country?
First of all, I would like to thank people of Davos, people of Switzerland, for hosting this forum in this beautiful city and in your beautiful country. This forum makes, I would even say, CEOs, business leaders of the world to be much more socially responsible, to recognize and to act, to make life on this planet, again, life of everybody better. So to recognize their responsibility for the world. And in moments like, for example, we had on the 24th, of course, we feel this responsibility. So when the first missiles started hitting Ukraine and killing Ukrainian people, you were, for example, I am, as the head of this company, I understand that I'm responsible for my employees again. I needed to evacuate some people from Kyiv, from other cities that were immediately damaged and impacted by this missiles hit. Then you realize that, for example, in terms of our company, or in case of our company, we're responsible for basically all Ukrainians, because we provide heating for 90% of Ukrainians. It was 24th of February, it was really cold. You understand that people can die not just because of Russian missiles and shelling, but also because they will just be left without heating, without natural gas, without electricity. And then you understand that, for example, we're not that big in electricity, but when Russians started heating our civilian infrastructure, and the power stations could not get coal, but they could still get gas. Again, we were supplying gas just to keep the lights on in Ukraine. Then you realize that, again, as the biggest company in Ukraine, we provide something like 25% of the state budget. You understand that the state needs money, people needs, they need support, again, humanitarian assistance. You feel all that responsibility. So, for example, when we had this battle for Kyiv, first 2 weeks, where inside Kyiv, and it's difficult to imagine. So, for example, again, I thought that we would never have such a war in Europe. And Kyiv is a beautiful European city. And you have tanks, you have, again, all these atrocities inside the European capitals nowadays. And you still have to run the company. You still need to make sure that everything, again, works uninterrupted. Then you, by the way, realize that it's not just Ukrainians that depend on gas that, for example, goes through Ukraine. It's also Europeans. Even Switzerland, by the way, gets natural gas that goes through Ukraine. And then you even have a very difficult moral dilemma, because on one hand, Russians are killing us. At the same time, again, European leaders are saying, look, please don't interrupt Russian transit of gas to Europe, because it may have some undesired consequences for Europeans. Again, for Switzerland as well. So Russian gas was going through Ukraine to Switzerland during the war, and we had to make sure that it's uninterrupted. All these days, we provided uninterrupted transit of gas to Switzerland as well. So, of course, then you cannot sleep again. So, in moments like this, you understand that when you are a business leader, you in fact may have even more responsibility because many people depend on you. And if you were, again, I see many people, young people in this audience. So you are studying a lot. You're preparing yourself for something, for the moments like this, when all that you have studied, all that you can do, basically, you have to implement to help your people.
When we talk about these life-changing moments, and that's something that the President alluded to it, that we in Switzerland are not used to. We don't know the war. We know it from what we hear from our parents, grandparents. But those life-changing moments, that's something we want to know more about, and I think that's the moment I bring Nadia Murad in. We heard that the year 2014 for Yevgeny was a year of change. 2014 was a huge year of change for you as well. You were living in northern Iraq, and something terrible happened. If you could just share this story with us, maybe.
Yeah, well, let me start by saying that the name of this forum is Working for Peace, and I don't think we can build peace without justice. So in 2014, the world watched as ISIS established a plan to eradicate the Yazidi community from Iraq. And that plan included sexual violence. So ISIS did not hide its intention to eradicate us, but nothing was done to stop them or to protect us. We were completely abandoned by our own government in Iraq and by the international community. And ISIS did what they wanted to do, and the results were they murdered more than 5,000 people, including 6 of my brothers. And they killed old women, including my mom. And they took over 6,500 women and children into sexual slavery, including myself, my sisters, my nieces, my sisters-in-law, my friends, my cousin, and everyone that I knew in the village. And, you know, ISIS published videos and there were clear signs of what they were up to do to the Yazidis. And until today, we have more than 2,800 women and children in captivity, missing in some parts of Iraq and Syria and even in Turkey. You know, 8 years later, families are still waiting for their loved ones to be returned. Nothing was done to protect these women and children, but also even after that, we have working with the international community, with the Iraqi government, to establish a task force to search and rescue these missing women and children from ISIS captivity. But we have failed, you know, to bring them back. Kidnappers, they called the families and asked for money, ransom for their return, but Yazidis, they have lost everything and they cannot pay for their loved ones to be returned. And ISIS, you know, in 2014, more than 400,000 people fled their homes, and it's been 8 years. 60% of them are still displaced within their own country, only 2 hours away from their homeland. And we, again, everyone failed to help them to go back and have a dignified life.
You said it, a lot of these girls, these women are still missing. A lot of them who are not missing were too scared to speak out and to say what happened to them. You decided to speak out, and you did it very openly, very publicly, against all odds and also dangers. Can you tell us what made you speak out? What was the main reason why you thought for yourself, the world has to know?
You know, when ISIS attacked us, I didn't know what was waiting for me. And when I was trying to escape ISIS captivity, I also didn't know what was waiting for me outside. If the society will welcome me, if the world will believe me, if they will stand with me to rescue the others. And when I escaped the captivity, my world was a refugee camp, and I was in one of the displacement camp with my family. And I tried to tell my story, and even though my access was very limited to the media and the world to hear my story, but I was trying with everyone in the camp, and it was difficult. And I was one of the very few girls that speak out about what happened. You know, where I came from, sexual violence comes with a lot of shame and stigma, and it's very hard to talk about it. But I used my voice because I left girls who were age 8 and 9 years old, and they were repeatedly raped and tortured by ISIS. And many of them are, as we speak now, are still being raped by ISIS in a daily basis. So it was difficult, and it was not easy, but I was trying to do something for others. But then I was able to relocate in Germany, in the state of Baden-Württemberg, and there I found my voice, and I found support and a safe place, and I shared my story on the international stage with the United Nations, with hundreds of journalists. I write it down in details in my memoir, The Last Girl, with hope that I will be the last girl in a story like mine. But unfortunately, we are seeing that what I survived is happening right now in Ukraine against some women and girls.
When we talk about sharing stories, which is a very important thing to do, that begs the question, what do we do with it in the West or in countries like in Switzerland? Mr. President, I'm going to ask the question in English, but I'll leave it up to you if you want to answer in English or in German. When we hear these stories, as we said, we're not used to that violence or to war, but we all have a responsibility as people as well. How can we react to these stories? What can we do? And maybe also for a politician, for a representative of a country, how difficult is it to react accordingly? Because I'm sure you feel that personal responsibility too.
The first wave we expect when such a history comes out is a very strong moral response from the community, and of course then from the politics, because the politics is the reflex of community. And actually we are speaking about one history here, of course, but as you correctly said, there is plenty of them. And we are, as a country, very committed in cooperation with the multilateral organization, and very often even on a bilateral level, in order to fight against this violence, this sexual violence on girls and on women worldwide. What we can do is a variety of actions. Maybe the first most important institutional answer is to join forces with the appropriate multilateral organization that are fighting against us, UN agencies and others. Secondly, we are actively discussing the issues in every possible occasion, and as well as in the bilateral discussion from a state to another state, as in the multilateral setting. Thirdly, we support very often, even financially, NGOs fighting against that. The Swiss Parliament votes every 4 years a frame credit for fighting against poverty, violence, and such wrong things in the world. And it's about 12 billion, so about 4 billion every year. It's a lot of money, and this is money of you, coming from the population, from taxation. And with this money, we, of course, finance many organizations and actions that are fighting against those things. Then we are committed to develop international law for sanctioning those who are doing that, for reestablishing memories and the truth about what's going on. For these commissions that are looking at the facts, making reports, trying to bring up the reality to the knowledge of humanity. These are things we are currently do, even in Iraq, and of course, all over the world, because unfortunately, it is not the single place where such things are happening. And this is the ways like the country reacts to those violence and unacceptable acts.
Just one question for you as a person. You're a foreign minister of Switzerland as well. Do you feel helpless sometimes?
Well, I guess every human being is predestinated to feel helpless, because we cannot fight against every things which is unacceptable in the world. We can fight, but we can have success. We can't just think, if I fight, I will be successful. So we have to tolerate frustration, which is not a feeling of being helpless, which is just a feeling of not being successful, which is another thing. Not being successful belongs to humanity. We are not successful to many things in the world, but it would be bad if we wouldn't be engaged in trying to fighting against what is wrong. And yes, but frustration, you should tolerate frustration, and this is not easy, especially by young people.
Apologies, Evgenia, I cut you short, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the Nadia's thought, saying that after the liberation of Bucha and Irpin, we actually see the real war crimes committed by Russia on our territory. We're seeing that unprecedented number of rapes, people killed, tortured. And that is something that is also deeply touched me, being as well on a safe place. But you actually feel this pressure physically on your body, something that is committed to your nation. And we really need to think about it and remember it. And I really think that peace, I really support this idea that peace is impossible without justice. And I guess this Russia War Crimes House, which is now seated here in Davos as well, it makes a strong point that we need to prosecute and we need to remember, we need to share personal stories of people who face this injustice and this violence. And we have to rebuild and rethink, reform the whole architecture of international law so that we can effectively address those violences.
Yuriy, yes, please.
I just wanted to step in terms of what the West can do. First of all, I would say that Ukraine is a European country. We are as European as Switzerland. And it's important to understand that Ukraine is just unfortunate to be on the front line of this common battle of a free world, of a civilized world, against barbarians. Again, barbarians that committed all these terrible crimes to Nadia and her family. Barbarians who raped, again, 8-year-old girl in Bucha, in Kiev, or near Kiev, just weeks ago. So that is why, first of all, we need to realize that we don't do enough. So if it happens, if it continues to happen, we need to do more. What can we do? Again, it to some extent depends on politics. I understand that Switzerland, for example, is a neutral country. But I heard the speech of the Swiss president at the forum, and I also, again, know the position of the Swiss people that do not let politicians confuse neutrality with some indifference, or in some cases, complicity with crimes. So you can be neutral, but you cannot be complicit, or you cannot be indifferent of crimes. That's very, very obvious, because then there would be no justice. And people who commit these terrible crimes, they would feel that they can always go to countries that are indifferent, you see, and go again without any accountability. Second, I would say that, in Davos, in the World Economic Forum, for many years, this topic of environmental sustainability is one of the most important topics. And again, with many young people in this room, I understand that maybe all of you are very environmentally cautious. You want to live, I mean, maybe I'm not that young, but I still consider myself young. So, and I want my kids, I have 3 kids, so I want them to live on a planet without any cataclysms, in a good climate. And I want, again, them to ski, and I want my grandparents to be able to ski in Switzerland, and that you still have snow. You see, so that's why, again, we are all fighting this climate change. But this situation with Ukraine, and to some extent the situation in the Middle East as well, reminds us that we also have to care about geopolitical sustainability of energy and our consumption, something that was neglected. So when you consume energy that comes from countries with rogue regimes, like Russia, for example, and there are some other countries in the world with rogue regimes, that's not a responsible consumption. So again, in general, we have to consume energy responsibly, because it hurts our climate. But we should be also mindful of geopolitical consequences of when you're paying billions of dollars to regimes like Putin that then kill innocent people. Again, for example, just, I mean, maybe I'm too pragmatic, I'm a businessman, nobody's perfect, but for example, Putin regime is still getting from Europe every day $1 billion for Russia exports of oil and gas. So the European Union, for example, provided in assistance to Ukraine $1 billion in March, although they paid to Putin $30 billion, again, to finance his war. Of course, again, it should stop. So that's why this responsibility of people to consume responsibly, to put some pressure on politicians, to be mindful of the environment, to be mindful of geopolitical consequences, so that politicians do something when they pay these huge amounts of money, maybe even taxpayers' money, to Putin and to terrible people like Putin who are then committing these crimes.
I mean, what you allude to is, of course, the dependency of the West also from Russian oil, gas, that maybe many people weren't really aware of until this war. Which brings me to the question, Mr. President, we live in a very intertwined world, in a very linked world, and it is complex, and business and politics and our social well-being go together. When we look at the topic of this discussion, how can we work together to make this a better place? Has the world become a little bit too complex, maybe, to find easy solutions or easy ways out?
Well, the dream beyond the globalization was we agree on some rules and we act according to them, and we foster our trade, our cooperation, our fighting against for human rights and against the violation of human rights, like we heard before from Nadia. And this was the dreams of the society in which I was born and I grew up in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And now, far away from World War II, we are thinking, we have to rethink ways in order to rebuild such a society, because nobody does know exactly why, but as far away we are from the World War II, the less we remember about the crimes of these wars, and we are somewhat ready to redo the same, which is just incredible. So stupid is the human being, but this is not new. We know it from history. Thousands of years, we remake the same mistakes every time and again, every 3-4 generations, a new war, new killing, then we are incredibly sad about that. We have to rebuild the world, and then we remake. And this is what makes me really frustrated in the humanity, that we cannot learn from our history. But again, yes, I think globalization was this dream of establishing common rules, the United Nations, the agencies, and so on. And then maybe we have been lost in transition in these common rules. We weren't ready to react early enough to some behaviors who wasn't okay according to the rules. And I guess we have to rethink about that. How can we there is no chance. In this world, with the technologies we have today, we cannot just consider to make blocks, 4 or 5 or 6 blocks, because we will lose an efficiency, we will expect less prosperity and less security. But how to establish a rule-based world, accepting that not every community is willing to share the same values. Maybe one mistake we made was not to define clearly what are fundamental rights. At the very beginning, after World War II, we were talking about a right of freedom, a right of control on your body, right of control on that. And then we just increased every year, every decade, these rights, and at the end it was like, how should I say, losing of concentration of what is really important. And you cannot expect from every population of the world having different religions, Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, and so on, to be identical in every single item of the. But we should define a common agenda, a common pool of fundamental rights that are really universal and intangible.
Speaking of this, and Evgeny, I'll come to you in a second. One might say, arguably one of those rights is the right to live where your family lives, or to live where your heart is. I spoke to the Deputy Prime Minister of the Ukraine today, and she told me that 96% of all Ukrainian refugees at the moment want to go home. They want to return to their home. Nadia, you come from a community where a lot of people, you spoke about it, women, girls, they had to flee. They had to leave their home. You had to leave your home as well. One of the first victims of every conflict is the population who has to flee, who has to go out of the country, displaced persons. How do we deal with that issue? And is it taken seriously enough by the international community when we speak about the role and the despair of refugees?
You know, we have to remember that no one wants to flee their home. It is one of the worst injustices a person can face. You said that 90-something percent of Ukrainian wants to go back to home. 8 years ago, Yazidis, they want the same. They were forced to flee their homes. And more than 400,000 people flee their homes to northern Iraq. And it's been 8 years, and nothing was done to help them to go back and have a dignified life. Only a whole, 60% of the Yazidi population are still displaced inside their own countries. The 150,000 people have returned back to Sinjar. We have empowered them through Nadia's initiative. The world again neglected them, our own government, and people that have been back to Sinjar, they are struggling to access to healthcare, education, and livelihoods. But in these placement camps, and when the conflict ends, we don't really focus on sustainable solutions. And I have witnessed that firsthand in IDP camps in Iraq. I lived in one of the camp for over a year, and I was seeing my community, and especially women and children, being victims once again of exploitation. People were using them, and they had no future and no plan. They were just waiting for tomorrow. They didn't know what to do, and traffickers were taking advantage of them and using them. And not everyone was able to make it to Europe, but I mean, it's been 8 years, and I'm afraid that we will do the same with the Ukrainian people who are willing to go back to their homes. But we just failed to protect them, as we did with the Yazidis, and then we failed to help them to go back and support them in a long, term solutions. That is why I founded Nadia's initiative, because my hometown was neglected. People were in these camps. There is right now a child marriage, suicide, and so many children have been born in these camps, never seen outside the camp. And survivors, they have been stuck in these camps and being re-traumatized again and again, telling their stories, but they can't find a safe shelter. In survivors of sexual violence, they need immediate needs, like there are immediate needs, but these are like not available in these placement
They need
camps.
counseling as well, of
In
course.
these placement camps.
Yes, please. Yuriy.
If I may add, again, of course, it's protecting your home, your motherland. That's very important. Just because, again, as Nadia mentioned, it's one of the biggest injustices when you have to flee your home. So that is why our brave soldiers right now are defending Ukraine. So that's why many of thousands of employees from our company went to defend Ukraine. At the same time, those who are still not in the army, but who are still, for example, providing critical supplies, critical utilities to Ukrainians, then they go under bullets. I'm not exaggerating. So 21 of our employees were killed on the job. But they still go under bullets, again, to repair some gas pipes. For example, like a practical story, a city of Kherson. There is a centralized heating plant over there. So Russian occupation forces came to the city, killed 2 of the employees inside the plant. The rest, they just locks the doors. They stayed there for a week. But they were providing utilities to their own town because they were afraid that, again, their people, their families would just freeze. It's also important so that people don't flee Ukraine and they want to return, to make sure that Ukraine can still survive even as an economy. That's why, for example, we're still providing all the utilities to Ukrainians. So there's still electricity, again, heating, gas, everything in Ukraine. It's very difficult when Russian missiles are hitting our infrastructure every day. We have shortages here, there, and everywhere, but we're still, again, in this very important job to provide these critical utilities to Ukrainians. And that's where the international community can also be next to us, so that together we can, while we still can, to make sure that Ukrainians are more or less, again, okay in Ukraine, so that they don't need to flee. Because when you have to flee, it's already very bad. So if now we can keep Ukrainians in Ukraine, we can provide some basic utilities to them. We can make sure that, for example, Ukraine can export food, grains, again, to help people in Africa. Ukraine is one of the biggest exporters of food in the world. We grow, again, agricultural products, we cannot export them. It's a problem for Ukraine, it's also the problem for people in Africa. They will starve soon. So it will cause some huge and terrible consequences around the world. So that's why, until it's too late, together we need to do a lot to make sure that, again, humanity wins in Ukraine, because it's just the front line.
Evgenia, when we hear this, and under these circumstances, it's very hard to imagine how this can end, how this will end in a, let's say, peaceful manner. And this brings me to a possible peace plan or negotiations. Is this even an option for you as an Ukrainian, that you think about these times and what we could do maybe on an international level to at least bring a ceasefire to your country, or even speak about possible peace plans, or is it just too early?
It's a really challenging question, I would say, because as all of you know, Ukraine was trying to negotiate as well in the beginning of the war. And right now as well, we are trying, the Ukrainian side is trying to negotiate on saving Mariupol military to the safe place, right? Who are now in the humanitarian catastrophe. And we can see that it's actually going really hard. It's really hard too. Of course, we need to think about ceasefire. Of course, that's our priority. And then we need to negotiate. But I think as Ukrainian, we need to liberate, and we want to liberate. And it's just that if Ukraine falls, like, Russia will not stop. Europe then at risks. It's not about a peace deal, actually. It's about victory. We need to win, because this war is not about over territory or over resources. This war is about values and fundamental rights. And Ukraine is paying such a higher price with our lives, thousands of lives of civilians, of military, of our young, really talented generation, to protect our country, and not only country, but the whole international order, the Europe, the international security, from the values that we are not sharing. And also maybe making a remark that we need to rethink the values. I think the values are here, and Ukraine now is fighting for that, because we are fighting for freedom, we are fighting for independence, we are fighting for democracy. That are fundamental values that we established after the Second World War. And now we see that freedom is not free. We are paying the price. And we unite the whole community with values. So this is actually an opportunity to verify whether you are standing with us with the same values of democracy, of freedom, of right to life, of freedom of independence. So that's actually here in place. So I guess that's not about a peace deal, it's about a value.
It's about fundamental values at stake, and this is where we all come in, and this is where the international community comes in, by working together. President Kassis, you said yesterday in your speech, and I quote this in German, gemeinsam heißt, dass das Denken.
Together means that thinking in larger terms is more important.
The position that Switzerland can take in this conflict, but also in other conflicts. Where is the role of Switzerland? And without going too much, I think, into the neutrality discussion, but where can we help in order to maintain these values and defend those values? Because it is a question of defense of values.
Yes, it is a matter of fact that we belong to the Western world. This is not a matter of discussion. And since we are belonging to the Western world, we are sharing the Western values. And this is maybe the difficulty. We decided after World War II, I have to come back to World War II, that the Western values would be the universal values. And this is a little bit a misunderstanding, because either we believe that we can impose these values all over the world. I'm not thinking, of course, about Ukraine, but about China, about other cultures. Well, then I'm sure that conflicts are predestinated. And this is also somewhat has had to do with Ukraine and Russia. Genia said perfectly, it's a matter of values and fundamental rights. And now the population of Ukraine has decided these are their values and their fundamental rights. They have a territorial integrity, they have a national sovereignty, up to them to decide without being influenced what kind of value. They decided. And of course, Russia doesn't like it. Because Russia, I don't know Russia, but the president he's still legitimate by an election. The population of Russia seems not to share exactly these values and these fundamental rights. And conflicts is predestinated. So how could we refocus our values, our fundamental rights on maybe a smaller part, but that are really inviolable? That everybody, even countries thinking, wanting to live with other values, that they feel free to do that without feeling the need of invading all over the world, because, I mean, this is a religious question. We know these questions. We have been knowing them for many centuries. Kreuzzüge and so on. This is known. Should we really have to invade all countries in the world in order to put our values over there? And this question is unresolved. We have a globalization, we have ICT, we can be with no place and no space all over the world, but we didn't resolve in an accurate way the question of how can we live with different sets of values and accept that it is the question.
It's such a fundamental question, and it's a personal question. As President Zelensky said yesterday as well, we all have to look into the mirror and ask ourselves what we can do. Yeah. And since it's a personal question, I would be very interested in your points of view as well. So even if it's a bit too early, I would love to get you involved. And I see some hands coming up. So let's open the discussion right now. We do have microphones in the room. Let's take, this gentleman was the first, then I come to you, and then to the gentleman in the back, and then all is open. And if you have a question, please go ahead. Let's start with the gentleman in the first row, please. And again, Sie können es auf Schweizerdeutsch oder auf Deutsch.
You can also ask your questions in German.
Is it on? I see the light, but let's try again. Nope. Maybe we'll have a different one. Okay, let's try again. There you go.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I have a question to Mr. President. In order to solve a problem, I think it's very important that first we name it properly. And the act of subjecting violently and exterminating another country, another people, be it in Iraq, be it in Ukraine at the moment, it has a name. It's called imperialism. And in Western Europe, we know also it under the name of colonialism. And what is extraordinary is that most of Western European countries have been colonial powers. Spain, Portugal, Italy, France, UK, Germany, Sweden, Poland. And one of the rare countries which has not been an imperial power and didn't try to colonize others was actually Switzerland. And so I think that on this debate you have an important role to play. And Ukraine, throughout its history, has been the victim of imperialist attempts of all its neighbors. And what we're seeing now, since 2014, like Evgenia reminded us, is no different than what we saw during World War II, except that during World War II there were two imperial powers trying to take over Ukraine. There was the Third Reich and there was the Soviet Union. So given the fact that Switzerland is one of the very rare countries in the West that doesn't have a history of imperialism and colonialism, isn't there a role for you to help call what it is of what is happening at the moment? Because I hear very few political leaders naming this war but by exactly what it is. And nobody is trying to contradict President Putin by calling on Ukrainian fascism, which is the most absurd thing I've ever heard, because right now the fascism and the colonialism is coming from Moscow.
Thank you very much. Are we saying enough about it, the President?
Well, I absolutely agree with your analysis of the situation. It is exactly what's going on. Russia has an imperialist action, and he wants to impose its new values to the Ukraine. He's scared that the Western values are coming too close to Russia. This is what's going on at the moment, and this is exactly the same reason why wars have been fought during centuries. Now, coming up to Switzerland, yes, exactly. We do not have the same colonialist past like the bigger powers around us, Italy, Germany, France, and so on. And so we are predestinated to play a particular role. And it is exactly what we are doing. We have been doing it for 200 years almost, even more. And we are continuing to do it. The fact that we organize in Switzerland in some weeks a Ukraine recovery conference in order to think about the time after the war, how to reconstruct, to rebuild the country. It is exactly coming from this spirit of being serving the international community, of doing our part in the international community. At the same time, we had to recognize at the very first beginning of the war that the war on values was beginning, and we had to clearly say what are our values, and we didn't have to invent them. They are written in our constitution. So we are neutral, but we have values, and we cannot misunderstand neutrality as an instrument not to have position, not to have values. We have clear values, and you decide, the population decide the constitution, and we are elected in order to defend these values and to support these values. This was the decision of the Federal Council at the beginning of the government, and it was somewhat understood in many countries, not just in Switzerland, many countries in the world, that Switzerland is giving us neutrality. No, it's a wrong comprehension of neutrality.
May I add? Excuse me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yuriy?
I would just like to add, there was a country many years ago that was surrounded by empires with clear imperialistic ambitions. And by the way, it was not even a country. There were different, more or less countries. Again, people with different languages, with maybe different views, slightly different landscape. Some had more mountains, some had less mountains. And then they decided to unite, because they understood that the only way for them to defend their common values was to have a unity, and also a defense alliance. They were one of the probably first democracies in Europe, by the way, especially not a monarchy. They were one of the best fighters in Europe, and they decided that together they can defend their values. So it was a unity, an alliance, and a defense alliance. That country is called Switzerland, because it's basically a confederation of cantons. So it's not basically that it was just created by God like this. It's like people from different cantons, in order to defend their values, their democratic values, they united. That is why the only solution for peace in Ukraine is for Ukraine to be a part of this kind of defense alliance. Call it NATO, call it somehow with a different kind of definition or whatever. But it should be an alliance that can defend the values. We have these values. You have these values. You have these values. But sometimes values, they have to be defended, because there will be people, like again in Switzerland 500 years ago, or again in Ukraine now, that want to kill people with these values, because their values is a challenge for their power. Because people with democratic values is a challenge for their authoritarian regimes. They will be killing people with these values. So people with these values have to be able to defend themselves.
And I think it has to be said, even if it's frustrating, we live in a world right now where less than 50% of the population live in a democracy. So it is values that we have to defend as good as we can. I haven't forgotten you. First it's the sir in the second row, then I'll quickly go to you, the lady in the second row, then I haven't forgotten you, and then I see plenty of hands will all come to you in a second, please.
Hi,
maybe we can make the questions as short as possible.
Yes,
so we can
let me go straight to the point. There is domino effect to this war, right? I live in Africa, and I just like Mr. Vitrenko said, the prices of the commodities are going crazy. Food insecurity is a major problem. Food insecurity will cause, it's not possible to have peace when people are hungry. I just want to know, what are the world leaders talking about resolving that issue? Ukraine might be the issue right now, but there's no wheat, there is no oil. The prices are insane, the inflation. People do not have food. It could lead to some kind of civil war. I don't know what it could lead to, but how is world leadership answering the question of hunger, which is facing us very shortly?
Very good question, because what's going on in the Ukraine has effects in the whole world, in Africa, for example, as well. How can we deal with this issue?
I can answer very shortly. Stop the war. This is the way to solve the problem. And in order to stop the war, we have to be engaged, and you have to be ready to suffer a little bit. Maybe you can't stop the war just for free. And this is what we, the states, with them values are trying to do. Of course, we know that it's not in our interest to let our population suffer because of not heating homes or not having enough food. But we have to accept that there is a price to pay if you want to fight for your values, and it's not for free. And this is what I saw in my introductory remarks. We should not believe that God has chosen us to be free and to be prosperous. We have to conquest this freedom and this prosperity continuously, and this needs passion and is also sometimes a little bit suffering, yes.
I hope you don't mind if we just go to the question here in the second row. I haven't forgotten you, sir. I'll come to you for the next question. Yes, please, the lady in the second row.
Yes, thank you. So we heard a lot about that we already have that values, and we have the rules and declarations, and we have the United Nations declaration. There should be no war anymore, so why does it happen? So why don't we align on our values? The values are existing. So it starts with us, of course, each of us, to start to live that. And for me, for the economies, it's also about remembering maybe the honorable merchant, where you live those values. Hundreds of years ago, you had that statutes, and where you have that shared values principles. And some of you, you're living that, you're doing that as company CEOs, but it's also part for me for having freedom, because it's also care about outside. And I wonder where does it come from? Because we are talking about the values, but we don't look where is the real cause that the values were not being lived. Where is it?
I fear that's the $1 million question that nobody can answer in such a quick. You can try, Evgeny.
So basically, the question is what is the causes for the price for the values? Like what?
Where is the issue? We all know where the issue is, what the problem is, but why can't we just live it? And why isn't it happening? Why isn't it? Why do we? Mm-hmm. The question of why. Yeah, where does this come from?
So why the war is happening? Why? Because basically we are not sharing the same values. That's actually already was discussed, I guess. And maybe to address in more specific how we can protect our values, it's basically just to stop a war. It sounds really general, but we have concrete steps to make it happen by imposing sanctions and exploring sanctions to the banks or to the economy of Russians that is going on, by imposing the embargo on oil and gas that is also subsidizing the Russian aggression to Ukraine. So I would say the reason why it's happening is because values are not there shared by Russian aggression, right? And Russian invasion to Ukraine. But we are united with our values. Therefore, we need to be here.
Quickly, Yuriy, please, and then I'll go to the gentleman in the back.
Very quickly, unfortunately, probably it's a biology that people, the competitive nature of people, again, we compete from the very beginning. It can be a good competition when, for example, again, Swiss skiers, I'm just a passionate skier, so Swiss skiers, again, old and young, they win just because they're better. But also, unfortunately, there are politicians, especially in young nation states, they come and they consolidate through their power through threatening their people with non-existent external threats and by feeding their nations with this very smug feeling of superiority, that you are superior not because you're a better skier or you studied harder and you work better, but just because you belong to a certain nation, to a certain superior nation. That's a very fascist ideology. That's exactly what Hitler did, and that's exactly what Putin is doing. And again, I'm not a big expert in ISIS, but what I hear is more or less the same.
You know, when we see clear signs that some vulnerable communities are in danger, that women and girls are in danger, we must act. But when we fail to act and protect them, and after that we should support them and we should provide justice and hold perpetrators accountable. That is the only message you can send to the other groups, no matter where they are, to tell them that you will be punished for what you are going to do. More than 5,000 European nationals committed crimes of genocide and sexual violence against women and minorities in Iraq and Syria. And 8 years later, we have all the evidence, testimonies that UNITAD, a UN team, collected thousands of evidence from mass graves in Iraq and from survivors. And only one ISIS have been held accountable in Germany last year. So it will be repeated if we don't send a clear message. And Germany did that, and I think other European countries should follow the Germans' example and send a clear message that those who went all the way from Europe to Iraq, they didn't go there for vacations. They went there and committed crimes, and they need to be held accountable so that these crimes are not repeated. And same happened with Boko Haram, and now we are seeing happening in Afghanistan with women. So we failed to protect them, but after we failed, we should hold them accountable.
So the question of justice again. Yes, please, the sir in the back row. Yes, and then I'll come to the young ladies in the front.
Mein Name ist Guido Schmitz-Kummer, ich bin Journalist.
Hello, I'm a journalist. I was a correspondent in areas of war for 6 years. However, I have never seen a weapon that has not been used to kill. In what way does Switzerland take an active role in protecting vulnerable people? Should we really continue to sacrifice our values? Madeleine Albright said that 500,000 of lives are just collateral damage. So how do we make a difference between this very pragmatic approach and a human approach? What would be your analysis of the situation? Well, I think that we should only emphasize what the president said. No matter whether I agree with Russia or not, I need to be able to talk to these people. That's what's happening in Switzerland. We try to find a consensus, and we need to bring all of the stakeholders together to get them talking, because of course I understand the position of Ukraine. They want to stick it to the Russians, but my personal experience is that if we continue to deliver more weapons in the Ukraine, this will only increase suffering. Well, maybe, do you think that Switzerland has a role as a peacemaker? Yes, I think that the traditional role of Switzerland is such that that we have to be active. In the first 72 hours after the war began, we were facing a dilemma. To put it quite simply, we had to ask ourselves the question, do we want to align ourselves with EU sanctions? That would mean that we would actually pick a side. It would mean that we are on the same side as the West, and even though we might share the same values, it would have been a very clear signal. However, not taking that step and not holding up these sanctions, that would be even more complicated, especially since the Swiss people had a very clear opinion on this war. This is why the Swiss government decided to take a stance, even though we knew that this decision would deprive us of our usual neutral position in the first months of the war, because we were used to being a mediator, to have this role as a mediator. And for Russia, it was very clear, once we made this decision, that Switzerland was not on the Russian side. It was difficult for me also during talks with the Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs. He made it very clear. He said Switzerland has lost its credibility as a neutral country. But where we had to disagree was what the definition of the word neutral was, because being neutral, that does not mean not having any values, not having any convictions. It was difficult to explain this difference, but for us it was clear from the beginning that we could not look away, we could not accept this very horrible situation where Russia broke with many laws, because all of these principles are important for Switzerland. If we are unable to uphold these values, what are our values? So this was more important to us than the potential role as a mediator. We had to really draw a line and say, this is not the role that we can play in this conflict. And then we saw that Turkey was very eager to take up this position. That doesn't mean that Switzerland has lost its role as a mediator after 200 years of this tradition on an international level. I think it's quite the opposite. I think by taking this clear position, Switzerland has shown which values we uphold and where we draw the line, where we want to build bridges and where we are unable to do so. I am convinced that at the end of this war, we will also be able to help build this bridge between Russia and the Ukraine.
We have two young ladies who had a question or a comment. I would suggest that maybe we give them the microphone. Maybe you can ask them one after the other, those two there, and we'll regroup them and collect them. Please go ahead.
In late February / early March, the EU was very fast impose sanctions and to condemn Putin for his actions. And could this potentially lead to a shift in government responses, for example, with what Israel has been doing to Palestine for decades, or to accept more non-EU refugees from Syria or Afghanistan?
Thank you very much. And can we have the second question, maybe?
So my question is more about the human rights of youth opportunities. I do come from Jordan, where I feel like it's lacking in opportunities for youth, and I wanted to ask Mr. President where he thinks, what he can say to the youth to not get discouraged and keep fighting for human rights in terms of youth opportunities in that region, that part of the world. Even if Jordan is at the forefront of the region, it still lacks lacks human rights for youth to take part in shaping the future of the region.
I would be very happy if the youth could agree on a package of human rights, of fundamental rights that are really indivisible. We think we have human rights today. Yes, of course we have. We have plenty of international law. We have plenty of rules. But this is a question of the lady on the right side. Why did those rights not work preventing this war? Because this was the target why we created many. And we have to reflect about that. Maybe we were too eager and we expanded too much this package of human rights, including every wishes. And then at the end, you can't define everything as a human right. You just be very selective in this definition and not be ready to accept any possible margin of maneuver. But you have to be selective. Otherwise, you make a homogeneous society worldwide, and this is not possible. The world, the human being has not been made to be exactly the same all over the planet. This is illusion. We have to accept that diversity exists, that diversity is something positive, but diversity is something, not something easy. And we have to find margin of maneuver in to allow diversity to express itself. But we have to have a common package of rules that must be respected by everybody. And this is exactly the reason why this war began. Because if Russia did respect the rules they accepted to respect, the war wouldn't never have begun. But welcome to the earth. These are the human beings.
This will be the final word. We're at the end of this discussion. We could have discussed hours and hours longer. Thank you very much for these insights, for this discussion together here. That's your applause. Thank you. And I'd like to finish with a beautiful sentence that I've read. It's from Nadia, actually, in an interview. He once said, "We must do more than merely endure. We must work toward a future in which the entire world, not just the Yazidis, say never again." So let's all say never again, and thank you very much for coming.